Hi, in this video I will talk to you about how to read critically and effectively in your assignments. So to begin with, I'd like you to think, why is it that we make you read? Some students think that it is because we as lecturers want you to get more knowledge. Other people may even think that it is because we want to make it hard for you because we want to give you really challenging things that make no sense. But actually, the real reason we make you read is because we want you to start to think for yourself. Often the readings you get would give you opposing opinions about a particular topic that you are investigating in your class. We want you to engage with those complexities and start to decide which side of the argument you agree with and why. So these readings we give you are the evidence that you use in your assignments. In another video, I talk about how the real structure of a good quality assignment is the argument you make. And this is the claims that you have that are backed up with evidence from your sources that you have read. So what then is a good source? In the link of this video, I provide a link to a tutorial where you can discover this further, but I would like you to understand that a good quality source is something that has been peer-reviewed. Peer-reviewed means that it has been evaluated by at least 2 other experts in the field who have decided that it is a good quality argument that has strong evidence for its claims. You also want to check who the authors are, what affiliations do they have, what qualifications do they have, and so on. Do they actually have the expertise to make the argument that they have made? Are there any biases or conflicts of interest in the article? Now, these are declared in academic sources, and you may think that that's not important, but actually it really is. Because if you look at this example that I found on the internet, you will see this a study finds that most workers want to go back to the office more often, which sounds a bit interesting and you may want to click on it. This is probably a clickbait type article. But then when you go and look at it further, you discover that actually it is an article by people who build office buildings. So obviously there is a bit of a conflict of interest there and makes you wonder whether the findings they have are actually legitimate. So other things that you want to consider is what is the evidence that they've used to support their arguments? Are there references? So if you look at the reference list, does it actually match the in-text references that they've used? You do need to reference articles that are written in academic English most of the time. So that means you should look at the language and the publisher of the source. You can, of course, use articles in other languages, provided that they are written in an academic style and that they are published in reputable places. And you also want to look at whether it is original research or a second-hand account. So, for example, an original research article or a literature review or something like that would be appropriate sources to use. But a newspaper article about a research article is a second-hand source, and it's always better to use the original source. So on the slides, you can see some examples of things that are commonly used in assignments. So you can use books, academic books that are either single or multiple authors, edited books, the things that you actually physically get in the library, but also the electronic versions. You can also reference individual book chapters. This is often the case when there are edited books that are written each chapter by a different author, and so then it would make more sense to reference the individual chapter rather than the whole book. Research journal articles. So these are empirical research papers, literature reviews, conceptual articles, all of those sorts of things that you can access through the library databases. You can also use conference presentations, as these are peer-reviewed by other scholars and often are published as conference papers that you can reference. You can also use research theses, but I will highlight to you that a PhD thesis, at least at our university, is 80,000 words long. So that is a lot of reading to do. You may want to instead look that person up on Google Scholar and see if they've published any articles from their PhD thesis and then reference the articles instead. So to find these things, you can, of course, just type something into Google and you will probably find some stuff, but you'll also find a lot of less relevant stuff. So it is important to make sure that you use the academic databases. Now, in our faculty, the most commonly used databases are ERIC, A+, Scopus, ProQuest, Google Scholar, and PsycInfo, but you can use whichever academic database is most appropriate for the topic that you are using. And in another video, I talk about the searching and reading strategies that you can use, specifically search strategies like using quote marks, using and or, the Boolean operators, truncation, so using an asterisk to cut down a part of a word to improve your search, and things like synonyms and alternate spellings. You should also contact the library if you do not know how to use the library databases. So this is an example of an academic journal article. This specific one was published in Taylor and Francis's journal, Education and Developmental Psychologist. So this is the front page of this article on the internet. And you can see it has all the information you will need to be able to reference this later, including the article's title, which is the big bolded title in the middle of the page, the authors that are listed down the bottom. You will notice on this example, I am listed as the last author. That is because often on multi-author papers, the first person is the person who did the most work, and the last person is the senior author, the head researcher, the person who oversaw the project. Then there's the journal name and volume and issue number and things are in the top corner, and the page numbers are below the authors. And also the digital object identifier, which is the direct link to this front page. You'll also see other things like the metrics of the article and the abstract, which explains to you what the article is about. So when you go to the databases, you download the articles because you found an abstract that sounds relevant to your topic. Now, what will often happen when you download the articles, it'll save it as lots of numbers and letters.pdf, kind of like the red text down the bottom. Now, this is fine when you want to read that article right then, but you are probably going to have to refer back to this article later in the semester, and having lots of articles that are not really distinguishable is not super useful. So because of that, we recommend you rename the file after you've downloaded it. This includes the first author's surname, because this is what you will use for the in-text reference, as well as the year, and then some keywords about the paper. So it'll help you find the source more easily towards the end of the semester when you are using it again. Now, in terms of reading this source, the best advice I can give you is to imagine the reading as a conversation between you and the person who wrote it, because it is. They are trying to convince you of a particular idea. And if you can start to see what it is they're trying to convince you of, you can start to identify the argument being made. It'll make it much more useful for you to engage with the source critically, make notes, ask questions, those things. So start by having a purpose in mind. Know what this article is about and why you are reading it. Then think about, depending on the purpose of reading it, what sort of reading strategy you should use. Is this you just want a general overview, which you can just skim or scan the article? Is it main themes, so maybe a little bit more in-depth skimming? Is it specific information? Well, that just means you need to just scan it to the very part that you need the specific information and just read that little part in detail. Do you need really detailed information, in which case you would need critical or close reading? You need to use all these sorts of strategies for your reading, and you need to be able to distinguish between which time is best to use which type of reading. And remember that reading takes time. Make sure to allocate enough time when you are planning your semester so that you can engage with your readings critically. In terms of taking notes, there is no one correct way to take notes. What is important is that you need to have a good filing system. So you want to make sure that you record the full reference details, including page numbers and any page numbers for direct quotes. This is because you will need this for the referencing later. You should always distinguish between quotes from a source, paraphrases, and your own comments so that you don't by accident plagiarize. You can use abbreviations, symbols, acronyms, those sorts of things, as long as you will define them in your document so you can find them again later in the semester when you look at your notes again. I know it sounds obvious, but please do back up your information. And remember that backing up your readings and notes does not mean two files on the same computer or in the same folder, because if your computer breaks, that means you will lose all of that. So make sure to keep it in separate places so that it is properly backed up, like, for example, sending it to the cloud or an external drive or something like that, maybe emailing it to yourself. So there are many different ways in which you can take notes, as I said before. For example, you could annotate the PDF itself with your notes. You could have a handwritten notebook or a digital notebook where you take notes. You could use reference managing software such as EndNote to annotate the PDF and then attach the annotated PDF to your reference so it's easy to find. And there are many other ways. Find the one that works best for you. In my case, I like to annotate my PDFs and then I attach them to my reference in EndNote so that I always have the notes and the reference together. And then I also have a backup of the notes elsewhere in case the computer breaks. This is another example of note-taking of the annotations on the document, and you can see here this particular person likes to use little notes on the side for thoughts for herself and underlining key things. So she has developed a system over time that works for her. This is my example of having my annotated PDF attached to my EndNote library, which means I can always find my notes again easy next time. So when you are reading and you want to read critically, what you want to do is start to interrogate the text rather than just start from the beginning and read all the way through and just highlight everything or just accept everything you read. What you want to do is think about what is the argument being made, what is the evidence the person has for this argument, and how convincing do you find this argument? So to give you an example, let's say I'm writing an assignment about whether Android phones or Apple phones are the best type of phones for society. And I come across this source from Barbara Smith, who says that society would be better off using Android phones than Apple phones because Apple phone screens break more easily. Now, there are some questions that you would need to ask before you decide whether this is a good source of information to use. The most obvious question is, who is Barbara Smith? Like, where did I get this information from, right? Is Barbara Smith a respected expert in phone quality testing? Or maybe Barbara Smith is just my friend or my neighbor. Like, where did I get this information from? What sort of qualifications does the person have to be able to make this claim? Then think about biases or conflicts of interest you remember I mentioned before. So who does Barbara Smith work for? Perhaps Barbara Smith works for Android, in which case she would benefit from selling more of her phones, right? Perhaps she works for Apple. Well, and maybe in that case, she could actually lose her job for saying this, so her evidence may seem more credible. How can she actually make this a claim, right? What evidence does she have? Perhaps she really likes her Android phone and that's her only evidence. Or perhaps she's done a really extensive experiment where she smashed lots of phones underneath a very precise scientific machine and have conclusively proven this. If that's the case, you of course have a great source of information to use. If she's just my friend who likes her Android phone, well, then that's not a good source of information. All of these types of questions are not by nature already assuming the evidence that you found is wrong. All it is asking questions and more evidence before you decide that it is correct. So adopting a questioning attitude rather than an accepting attitude. So critical thinking is not negative thinking. It is just a questioning thinking more deeply before you choose to believe something. So when you are reading, you are actually critiquing your articles, and this helps you to locate and position yourself in the literature. Imagine the literature being something like this river of knowledge flowing, and there's all sorts of different things, some go in different directions, and you are deciding where you fit in the argument being made. And this is why you need to read critically. because all texts are constructed and interpreted by the person who wrote it and by the person who is reading it. So if I write my article, I'm writing my article based on my academic knowledge, of course, but also on my social, cultural, religious, political, etc. views. Right? And this shapes the type of arguments that I am making, which is embedded in my language. When you read my article, you are doing the same thing. You are using your expertise in your field, plus your social, cultural, religious, political, etc. views to interpret my argument and decide whether you agree with it or not. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't, and this is why there are different opinions in the field. So this is an example of a paragraph from an article that I recently wrote that does make quite a strong argument. And I'll give you a little minute to read it and think about what some of the values are that are embedded in this writing. Okay, so when you are reading this, you may think, oh, wow, that's a lot of academic English sounding words, which of course it is. But I would like you to focus on the argument here and what some of the things are that may be motivating me to make this argument. So I am here arguing that generative AI in this case can help scholars who come from non-English backgrounds better articulate their ideas in a space where English is still most valued, which is academia. Now, this argument comes from my own particular value that we should prioritize equity in academia, right? So you can see that through the word like epistemic injustice that I'm using, that is showcasing which value I'm coming from. And you can also see this in the way that I make the argument. I say, well, academia is like this, which creates this place but marginalizes these other people. You can see how I feel about these things, right? So this is an example of how values are embedded in writing. And when you can start to identify this in the things that you are reading, it'll help you engage more critically and decide whether you agree with me or not in this case. So things to do to move from receptive to productive reading is firstly to adopt that questioning stance we were talking about before. Explore the underlying assumptions or intentions of the article, but also your underlying assumptions, and engage in what we call the difficulty. So rather than just ignoring things that don't make sense or that don't fit your particular worldview, think about them. Why are they not fitting? What is causing the problem? Does it perhaps convince you in a different way, or does it reinforce your previous way of seeing things? So engage with this conversation with the text. Remember, I'm writing my article to convince you of something. So you should be having a conversation back to me as to whether I am convincing you. And then when you are reading, try to construct your knowledge rather than just accepting everything. Think about what you've been learning in class, what you've been reading in other places, your own life experiences and all these sorts of things, and try and draw them together, make connections between all of these things to be able to construct your own deeper understanding of something. This will then help you in your assignments to write why you think the way you do about things. So if you've got a topic issue that you're talking about, in the past you may have done what we call descriptive writing. So answering those basic questions of what, when, where, and who, right? Now, you do need to do that in your writing, but you need to move beyond that in your academic writing to that analysis, synthesis, and evaluation and reflection stage. So why, how, what if something different happened? What we're wanting you to do is look at the evidence across the field, not just things that agree with you, both sides of the argument. Think about why this side argues this way and this other side argues that way. Which side do you find more compelling? And why? And what then is the implications for others? And then explain that in your assignment. So it's an example from a reading. And you can see here that this one paragraph is using all of those color-coded things from before. The green sentences are just explaining something from the literature. The purple sentence down the bottom is an example of synthesis because it's got two sources put together. And you can see the big chunk of red text in the middle is the evaluation and reflection that we've used to shape the argument into the direction we are wanting it to go. So it's part of your reading to try and identify particularly the evaluation and reflection sentences. This will help you. It's also important for when you are doing your writing later to be able to be more convincing. It is for you to be able to do this evaluation and reflection and explain to your reader why you think the way you do. So questions that can help you do that include, what was the writer thinker assuming at the time when they're writing it? For example, what sorts of learners, the time frame, the resources, the organization, the social and cultural context, etc. Think about whether that would apply to your particular context. Why or why not? What is the author's purpose or values that have been embedded in this, and how might that frame what they are arguing? And how does it fit or not fit with other ideas that you know about? And think about what the writer has not considered. For example, if I'm writing my article, you'll remember I said I'm writing it based on my own experience, knowledge, beliefs, values, and so forth, right? There are some things that I know nothing about because I've never experienced them. So there are some things that I have not considered. And these are sometimes things that are blind spots for people, and they are like black holes where ideas are not actually explained. And you can then use that as a way to justify your particular way of thinking. So if you look at this particular paragraph, this is from another article that I wrote, you will see that here I am arguing about how particularly research data collected through surveys are particularly biased towards populations. And I'm citing some evidence from different sources that talk about how even what research that you would think would be quite objective are actually still quite subjective. Now, when you read this, you may think, oh, well, she's made a good argument. She's got a nice topic sentence with some good quality evidence from good sources there. But I'm telling you to remember to not just accept things, but to actually think more critically about these things. So one of these things could be talking about, for example, the IQ tests that are biased towards white students. This is something that is often quite surprising to people. And you would want more information about how I can make that argument. So then I can talk about this study, which looked at the original IQ tests and how they were developed, and showed that the way the questions were asked were culturally biased towards a particular population. And then you would have more evidence to decide whether you believe me. These are the sorts of critical thinking questions we want you to ask when you are reading articles. Some other things that you can do is, instead of just reading, actually taking some good quality notes. And in this case, I've got an example of a literature table. So you can include all the key things. And this will allow you, one, to engage with that specific reading in depth, but two, it will also help you to see patterns across the literature. This is particularly helpful if you are doing something like a literature review, where you are trying to synthesize ideas together. And if you can answer each block and then you can look at the columns instead of the lines, you'll be able to see patterns across the literature. One important thing to remember in your writing is that you are not doing descriptive writing. Remember, we're moving beyond the basic descriptive layer to be analytical. So as an example, let's imagine I'm looking at the literature on the benefits of doctoral writing groups, and I found all of these articles, and I've grouped them by theme in this case. So the first column talks about articles that all say being part of a writing group makes people physically write more words, right? Quantitatively more words by being part of it. The second one talks about how it increases people's motivation and confidence. And the third group over there talk about how the actual words that they write are better quality. So now I can make a better argument because I am looking at the themes rather than explaining what each article did instead. And so then you get paragraphs like this, and you can see I've highlighted the references in blue, and I've explained to you exactly what I just said on the previous slide, but in paragraph format. So now I'm making an argument. There are many benefits of writing groups. Here are the 3 key findings, right? So this is a much stronger argument rather than talking about one article and what they found, and then the next article, and then the next article. So I've got some helpful hints for you. I can't make reading easy. Reading is going to take a long time and is supposed to engage your brain, so it is a bit challenging. But if you start early and you read before your classes, this will help you a lot to engage more effectively with it. Make sure to organize your files, have a good filing system, and remember the taking the notes and backing them up. Read for a purpose. You don't need to read every article in detail. Sometimes you just need some general information or a definition or some key statistics. Other times you need really in-depth information. A pro tip I can give you if you're starting out with reading is to read the introduction and the discussion conclusion to start with. If you read the abstract, it gives you an overview of the article. If you read the introduction, it's going to give you an understanding of the previous literature and what the problem was this article was talking about. And then the discussion conclusion will talk about what they actually found and how they solved the problem. This will help you understand the purpose of the article, and then you can start to look at those other parts in more detail as is needed. And so when you do have things that are confusing or don't really make sense or conflict with each other, that's okay. That's supposed to happen. Talk about that. Talk about that with the reading, but also talk about that with your friends in the class, with your tutor. If there's something that you can't figure out, your teacher is, of course, there to help you. So talk out problematic issues. And don't expect to understand everything you read the first time around. I don't understand everything I read, and I've been in the university for a long time. It is okay for you to revisit things later.